You know, when it comes to putting drives into a system, you know, we talked about IDE configuration, but there's really steps beyond that, aren't there? Which is the actual mounting of the thing into the system. It ought to be easy, and many times it is. But as systems have become more modern, if that's the phrase, then it gets a little tougher. Now, because of our shortage of cables, we're going to put just 2 hard drives and a CD-ROM in, get that working. That's a fair amount of upgrade. And it's easiest to put the floppy in while I'm doing the hard drive. So we have a drive cage, you'll recall, and the drive cage is going to slip in like this. Sure it is, Mark. There we are. It's gonna like that, and it snaps. Now, typically, if you, there's just enough room in there for 3 drives. So there's going to be room for a floppy, and there's going to be room for 2 of the hard drives. The tricky part comes when you're trying to figure out where exactly to place these things in the cradle. Typically, when you're laying the drives out in the cradle, you're going to find, I stuck the screws in there so I wouldn't lose them, you're going to find that, that you put the floppy in wherever the hole in the front of the computer wants it to be, and it's the bottom on this particular computer. And then you put the hard drives on top of that. I have to say I'm not totally happy with this configuration, because this configuration is going to force me, if I want 2 hard drives and a floppy, to stack the 2 hard drives right on top of each other without any real ventilation space. I have to say this troubles me a bit, but having looked at the case of this computer, there's really no other place to bolt this, to bolt this thing. I would almost be inclined to mount one of these drives and drill a hole in the side of the case almost and mount the other one. But in any case, we're going to work with what we've got here for this example. And basically, this is what it's going to look like. Basically, we built a little drive sandwich here. And typically, the hard drives end up poking back behind the line of the cradle, and the floppy drive sticks out a bit, because remember, it's got to stick out in front of the computer. Now my next job is to line up the little holes in the cradle with the holes in the hard drive, and pop some screws in there. Again, we'd like to see 1 on either side. Very important. Even if you've only got a couple of them, put 1 on either side. Now, as you're screwing the drives in, you can preheat the oven to 270. Oh, golly, that's the cooking show. I always get confused about that. And that ought to go in nicely there. No, it won't. Faked myself out. The floppies have got different screws. Now, don't be surprised or don't be chagrined if you end up mounting all these drives in the cradle more than once. I know I've never gotten it right the first time. But you want to see 1 on either side for stability, as I've said a couple times already. And then you'll just slide the cradle in, and then I'll do a test on the front of the computer to see whether or not everything is going to fit together nicely. One day we'll have nice drive cradle systems where you just snap them right in. As a matter of fact, we do have that. You may start to see that on computers that you're buying. And this whole nonsense about opening up a computer and bolting drives in is an awful lot of work. And that's why some newer computers have a thing called device bay. It's a set of slots about the size of an 8-track cartridge, I guess I'm dating myself, across the front of your computer, and you just pop drives in. They can be hard drives, they can be CD-ROMs, DVDs, whatever, and it's basically a modified EIDE interface. Very, very cool. In any case, so as I said, I want to test this, because I probably have screwed it in wrong to begin with. And the drive cradle, as we saw, goes in here. I'm going to try sliding that in, and we'll see how that's going to look. If I stand it up like that, stand the computer up like that, that's looking pretty good so far, but let's get the front of the computer. After you goofed it up a few times, you learn to try this before you commit yourself too terribly to any course of action. See, and that looks like that's going to work okay, but we got that floppy jutting out just a little bit, so maybe we might try backing that off just a little bit. But the hard drives looks like we're good. We've got plenty of space for the hard drives. Again, the drive cradle is going to come out by squeezing these two little levers. And then those drives come out nicely for us. I'm going to move that floppy back in. When we come back, I'll put the cradle in. Okay, I've moved that floppy the way I wanted it, and let's stay on the shot here because I want to show you that another thing I discovered while we were out was that I originally had these set up to both be masters, as you recall from the IDE configuration section, but I was foiled by the cable length. Haha, I forgot to check the cable length. There's just not enough cable to make one of these guys the master and make the CD-ROM, which is far away, into the slave. So we've had to change of plan. This machine here, we've got a master here and a slave here, and if you see how the jumpers don't line up, the jumpers don't line up because one's going to be master and one's going to be slave. Anyway, so this ought to slide in very nicely now. It ought to anyway. If it doesn't, we'll just go to another break. Ah, look at that simplicity itself, friends. And the next thing that we're going to worry about is getting the cable on there. And as we've seen, remember that on an IDE configuration, unless you're doing cable select, doesn't matter which connector you use. But there is a nice little bump on this to help me make sure that I put this in the right order. I was kind of hoping to do it this way. Not going to work? Sure. Now, again, not all of you may have these drive cradles. You may just have the cases where you just simply bolt the drive into the side of the case. If that's the case, your installation, if that's the case, no pun intended, then there's no real difference. It's just maybe a little less fussing. I'm then plugging this into the motherboard, the location I've pointed out to you before, which is one of the IDE channels that are sitting on the motherboard. And I cheated and looked at the documentation to find out which one was the primary, because I want the hard drives to be on the primary. Why? Because we boot off the primary. If we're going to stick the CD-ROM on the secondary, that's fine, but we just typically don't boot from CD-ROMs. Well, let me take that back. In general, you don't boot from the CD-ROM. Many BIOSes allow you to do it in any case. Oh, but I haven't finished yet. See, remember I almost did that thing that I've told you 3 times not to do, which is I almost forgot to put power on this thing. And so the power is going to look like, once again, this Molex connector plugs in right in there. And another power connector over here. And the floppy, this particular floppy uses this Berg connector instead of a Molex connector. While we're here, let me show you how to plug in the floppy. Looking at the back of the floppy drive here. Looking at the back of the floppy drive, then there is this Berg power connector, which is going to slide right on. Once I get the pins all lined up, that is, then it'll slide right on. And then there is a data cable Now you're going to notice that a floppy cable is going to work a little bit differently. Floppy cable is going to look just a bit different from a hard drive cable. Floppy cable typically starts out on one end and you've got a good long amount of slack. And then up here by these connectors, the connectors are going to be the things that identify, in this particular case, it's like a cable select on an IDE. The connectors are going to be the things that are going to tell us whether this is an A drive or a B drive, and we'll come back and connect that in just a minute. So, anyway, back to the hard drives. So the hard drives have power. The hard drives have their data connections. The data connection is plugged into the motherboard, and so we're in pretty good shape here. That's going to be ready to go once we get the rest of the system hooked up and powered up.